If money didn't exist, how many days do you think a person could survive? Let's make the situation even a little harder. Imagine there are no grocery stores around and no one you can turn to for help. On top of that, all of this is happening in the midst of a war. During the American Revolutionary War, tens of thousands of soldiers lived exactly this kind of life. According to records, food was supposed to be sent to the soldiers on a regular basis. But more often than not, these promises weren't kept, and even their basic needs couldn't be met. To survive, some soldiers tried to make do with just flour and water for days on end. Worse still, some were forced to eat whatever they could find in nature. That's exactly why many people are wondering, what did a soldier actually eat when there was absolutely no food left? Before we get into that, I'd like to give you a quick reminder. If you enjoy historical documentaries like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I'm also curious, where are you watching this video right now? You can write it in the comments. Maybe we're in the same city, or even the same country. Now, without further ado, let's take a look at what American Revolutionary War soldiers ate to survive when food ran out. To understand what a soldier ate when the food ran out, you first have to understand what he was supposed to eat when everything worked. On paper, the Continental soldier was fed reasonably well. Congress established an official daily ration, and by the standards of the 18th century, it was generous. It called for around a pound of beef, or the equivalent in pork or fish, a pound or more of bread or flour, and a regular allowance of vegetables. There was supposed to be a measure of beer or cider, a ration of rum or whiskey on certain occasions, and small quantities of items like peas or beans, rice, butter, vinegar, and salt. If a soldier had actually received that ration every day, he would have been among the better-fed working men of his era. The plan was sound. It provided enough calories, enough protein, and enough variety to keep a man marching and fighting. The problem was never the plan. The problem was that the plan and reality almost never matched. Because a ration written on paper in a comfortable room in Philadelphia is not food. It is a promise. And between that promise and the mouth of a hungry soldier standing in a muddy camp lay a vast and fragile chain of farmers, merchants, wagons, roads, rivers, money, and men, any link of which could fail. And in the American Revolution, those links failed constantly. So the real story of what a revolutionary soldier ate is not the story of the official ration. It is the story of what happened when that ration did not arrive, which was often and of the desperate, ingenious, and sometimes disgusting things men did to fill their stomachs when the system meant to feed them broke down. The food ran out not usually because it did not exist, but because it could not be moved. And that distinction is the key to the whole story. America in the 1770s was an agricultural country. It grew enormous amounts of food. In most years, there was no true national shortage of grain or livestock. The farms of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and New England produced far more than the army needed. The soldiers were starving in the middle of a land of plenty. And understanding why reveals how a supply system actually works and how it fails. The first problem was transport. Moving food in the 18th century meant wagons pulled by horses or oxen over roads that were often little more than mud tracks. A wagon could only carry so much, and the animals pulling it ate a significant portion of what they hauled. Move food far enough over bad enough roads, and the cost of moving it exceeded its value. When the roads froze or flooded or turned to deep mud, the wagons simply stopped, and the food sat in depots while men went hungry 100 miles away. The second problem was money. The Continental Congress had no reliable power to tax, so it paid for things by printing paper money, and it printed so much that the money rapidly lost its value. The phrase, "not worth a Continental," entered the language for a reason. Farmers and merchants offered this collapsing currency for their grain and cattle, often preferred to sell to the British, who paid in gold and silver, or simply to hold their food back rather than trade it for paper that might be worthless by the time they spent it. The third problem was organization. The system for buying and moving army supplies was a tangle of competing agents, contractors, and officials, riddled with inefficiency and sometimes with outright fraud. Supplies were bought and then spoiled before they could be moved. Barrels of meat rotted. Flour turned moldy in damp storehouses. The machinery of supply, when it worked at all, worked badly, and the men at the end of the line paid the price in empty stomachs. So, what did a soldier actually eat when the beef did not come and the bread ran out? The answer, at the worst moments, was almost nothing, and what little there was became legendary for its awfulness. The single most infamous food of the Revolution was something the soldiers called Firecake. It was not a cake in any pleasant sense. It was the most basic food imaginable, made when a soldier had nothing but flour and water, and no time, fuel, or ingredients to make anything better. He mixed flour with water into a stiff paste, shaped it into a flat cake, and cooked it directly on a hot stone or a board by the fire, or simply in the ashes. The result was hard, tasteless, often burned on the outside and raw in the middle, and almost completely without nutrition beyond the raw calories of the flour. Soldiers' diaries from Valley Forge returned to Firecake again and again, usually paired with the same grim companion, water. The soldier and diarist Albigence Waldo, a surgeon at Valley Forge, recorded the bitter refrain of that winter, the complaint that there was nothing to eat but Firecake and water, day after day. When even flour was scarce, men ate whatever they could find. They boiled and ate anything that might yield nourishment. There are accounts of soldiers roasting and eating their own shoes and leather, of gnawing on birch bark and twigs, of boiling anything that could conceivably be turned into soup. There were reports of men so hungry they ate their pet dogs, and of others digging for roots in the frozen ground. Hunger of this kind does not care about taste or dignity. It cares only about the next hour, and the next. It is worth pausing on what sustained hunger actually does to a body of men. It is not only the sharp pain of an empty stomach. It is the slow weakening, the loss of strength that makes every task harder, the way the cold bites deeper into a man who has not eaten, the sickness that spreads faster through bodies with no reserves left to fight it. A hungry army is not just an uncomfortable army. It is an army losing its physical ability to march, to work, and to fight. A little more with every day the food does not come. And this is the reality behind the heroic paintings. For long stretches of the war, the Continental soldier was not a well-supplied fighter. He was a hungry man in worn-out clothes, standing in the cold, trying to turn flour and water into enough of a meal to keep himself upright for one more day. When the official supply failed, the soldier turned to the oldest source of food there is. He tried to take it from the land around him. Foraging was a constant part of a soldier's life. In camp and on the march, Men supplemented their rations with whatever the countryside offered. In the warmer months, this could mean a great deal. Soldiers gathered wild greens, berries, nuts, and fruit. They fished the rivers and streams, which in 18th century America teemed with fish in a way that is hard to imagine today. They hunted game where they could, and a deer or a few birds could transform the diet of a mess group for a day or two. Foraging parties were also sent out officially to gather food from the surrounding farms, sometimes buying it, sometimes simply requisitioning it, meaning taking it and leaving a promissory note that the farmer might never be able to redeem. This was a delicate and dangerous business. An army that stripped the countryside bare turned the local population against it, and the Continental Army depended on the goodwill of the people. Washington was acutely aware of this, and he issued strict orders against plundering, though hungry men did not always obey. The seasons ruled everything. Late summer and autumn, with crops ripe and game fat, were the times of relative plenty. A soldier in September in a rich farming region might eat quite well, but winter was the enemy. In the frozen months, there were no crops in the fields. The game was lean and scarce. The fish were hard to catch, and the land that had fed the army in the autumn offered nothing. Winter was when the official supply mattered most, and winter was also when the roads that carried it were most likely to fail. So, the soldier lived in a constant negotiation with the land and the calendar. In good country and a good season, he could fill the gaps in his ration himself. But when the supply failed in the depth of winter, when the land was frozen and empty, foraging offered little, and the man was thrown back on Firecake, on scraps and on hunger. Whatever food a soldier managed to get, he did not usually eat it alone. Like almost every army in history, the Continental Army organized its eating, and that organization shaped how men survived. Soldiers were divided into small groups called messes, typically around 6 men who drew their rations together, cooked together, and ate together. This was the basic social and practical unit of daily life. The mess pooled what its members had, whether the official ration, the results of foraging, or whatever could be bought or scrounged, and turned it into meals. Within each mess, cooking was often shared or rotated, and a mess with a clever cook was a fortunate mess indeed. The cooking itself was primitive. Most food was boiled because boiling was the simplest way to cook, and because it wasted nothing. Everything went into the pot. The meat when there was meat, the flour, the vegetables, whatever had been gathered, all simmered together into a stew or a thick soup that could stretch a small amount of food across several men. Boiling also made tough or questionable ingredients edible, and it produced a broth that carried warmth and some nourishment, even when the solid food was scarce. Bread, when flour was available and conditions allowed, was baked or cooked in various ways, from proper loaves when there were ovens to the miserable firecake when there was nothing else. Meat, when it came, was often preserved, salted or occasionally smoked, because fresh meat could not be transported or stored in the quantities an army needed. Salt meat had to be soaked and boiled to be made palatable, and even then it was a far cry from a fresh joint. The mess system did more than feed men. It bound them together. 6 men who cook and eat together every day, who share their hunger and their occasional plenty, become something more than a collection of individuals. In the worst times, the mess was where a soldier's survival was quite literally pooled, and the bonds formed over those shared pots of thin stew were part of what held the army together when the food and much else ran short. Hunger in the Continental Army was not only a hardship. At certain moments, it became a genuine threat to the survival of the revolution itself, more dangerous than any British army. Starving men do not fight well, and they do not stay long. Throughout the war, hunger drove desertion. Men who could not be fed slipped away to go home, where at least they could eat. And every deserter weakened an army that was chronically short of soldiers. The link was direct and obvious. When the food failed, the men melted away, and commanders knew that a starving army was an army in the process of dissolving. Hunger also drove mutiny. On more than one occasion, Continental soldiers pushed past the limit by a combination of no food, no pay, and no end in sight, rose in organized protest against their own officers. The most serious of these mutinies involved seasoned troops who had endured years of hardship and simply reached the end of what human beings could bear. These were not cowards or traitors. They were men who had given everything and were still being asked to starve, and their revolts shook the leadership of the revolution to its core. Washington understood, better than almost anyone, that the war could be lost not on the battlefield, but in the empty stomachs of his own men. His letters return again and again to the desperate state of his supplies, pleading with Congress and the states for food, warning in the plainest terms that the army would dissolve without it. He was not exaggerating. There were winters when the army came genuinely close to simply falling apart from hunger, and the fact that it did not is one of the quieter miracles of the war. This is the reality behind the heroic image. The greatest enemy the Continental soldier faced was often not the British soldier across the field. It was the empty ration wagon, the frozen road, the worthless paper money, and the gnawing hunger that could destroy an army from within long before any battle could. So consider, finally, what it actually meant to be a revolutionary soldier when the food ran out, and what that hunger bought. It meant waking in the cold with nothing certain to eat. It meant standing in line hoping the ration wagons had come, and often finding they had not. It meant mixing flour and water into a tasteless cake cooked on a stone, and calling that a meal. It meant watching the countryside for anything edible, boiling scraps into thin soup, and sharing what little there was with 5 other men in your mess. It meant, at the very worst, gnawing on leather and bark, and going to sleep hungry to wake up hungrier. And the men endured it, not all of them, and not without breaking, but enough of them for long enough to keep the army in existence. Every meal of Firecake was a small act of endurance. Every winter survived on scraps was a season the revolution did not collapse. The soldiers who stayed, who ate their miserable rations and their foraged scraps and their flour and water, and who did not go home, were holding the cause together with their own hunger. It is easy, looking back, to picture the American Revolution as a series of battles, of brave charges and famous victories. But the war was won at least as much in the space between the battles, in the long, hungry winters and the endless problem of simply keeping men fed enough to remain an army at all. The soldier who solved the problem of the empty plate, one miserable meal at a time, was doing something as essential to victory as any man who fired a musket. Life today is so different, isn't it? When we feel like eating something, most of us can get it in no time. But the soldiers back then didn't have that luxury. While we choose what to eat amid abundance, they were trying to survive for days on whatever tiny morsel they could find. That's why, for them, the struggle wasn't limited to the battlefield. Every day they had to face hunger, the cold, and the struggle to survive. I think this was one of the least discussed aspects of the American Revolutionary War. Just as much as the victories they won, the days they went hungry were also part of that independence. Now I'd like to ask you one final question. Have you ever gone through a truly difficult period due to hunger or deprivation? What would be the most important advice you'd give to someone in that situation?